Hey guys, we're back in our Navigating Doubt series this week. A couple weeks ago, we started the series just kind of trying to normalize doubt as a part of the Christian experience. This week and for the next 3 weeks, we're going to be what I'm going to call getting behind our doubts to try to see what's driving them and fueling them and motivating them, what's causing us to doubt. And this week in particular, we're going to look at what I'm calling experiential doubt. This is doubt that comes from our experience, usually our painful experience. So we're not doubting God's goodness because we look out on the world and see so much evil and wonder how God can exist in the midst of a world with that much evil. We doubt God's goodness because we don't feel like He has been good to us. And so it's much more personal, much more close to home than intellectual doubt, which is something we'll tackle later in this series. We're going to look at a few different characters who went through this themselves in Scripture. John the Baptist, Job, and Asaph in Psalm 73. So those are the three characters we'll look at in our main lesson. And this week's a little weird. We do this sometimes where I have too much to cover in the main lesson, and so I'm going to leave a couple of points for you guys to briefly hit in discussion groups before you get into some other questions. So we'll look at those three examples and give some strategies or ways to navigate through experiential doubt specifically. I'll cover two, and then you guys will cover two in discussion groups. The two I'll cover is to be honest about where your doubts are coming from and to not hide behind intellectual questions when really it's a personal, experiential issue. And then secondly, to check our theology, that as unpleasant as it is, oftentimes our doubt and confusion and questions when we experience pain and suffering comes because we have misapplied or misunderstood or even forgotten what God has said in His Word. Those are the two I'll cover. You can launch discussion groups by asking, as we usually do, if people have questions, if there's things they didn't understand, if there's comments that they want to make, anything like that. If they don't have anything, you can move on. If they do, address that. And the first thing you'll do is hit the last two strategies for how to navigate through experiential doubt, which we get from Psalm 73 and Asaph's episode of experiential doubt, that'd be a good psalm to just go and read the whole thing a couple of times ahead of discussion groups. And the last two strategies are to worship and to cling to an eternal perspective. Worship and cling to an eternal perspective. Those both come from Psalm 73:17. This is where the psalm really flips. The psalm is about past doubt that he had, that he's kind of recounting, and he's recounting how he felt that I'm being stricken and I'm righteous and the wicked are flourishing. And he says, I felt this way in verse 17 until I went to the sanctuary of God, until I went and worshiped, and then everything flipped. And so you'll fill in the blank for them on that and then ask them, how is that helpful? How is it helpful for us to push through experiential doubt by coming to worship? I've got a couple of things for you here. I'm sure you guys and students can come up with great things yourself. This can be helpful to just take our eyes and our gaze off of ourselves and put it onto the Lord, which is something that we can struggle with when we're going through hard times. We can be navel gazers, always looking at ourselves and what's wrong with our lives and never actually directing our attention to the Lord. And worship a worship service can force us to do that. When it's really difficult to do ourselves. Like, I don't want to pray, I don't want to read scripture, but if I go to the worship service, then I'm kind of moved into that by other people. And this can be like, you don't just naturally go to a worship service and feel better. You have to kind of battle in the midst of that worship service as you sing. You're not just singing empty words, but you're even praying as you do that. Like, I don't feel like singing Good Father right now, and so I'm praying, I'm singing it, but as I'm singing, I'm praying, Lord, I don't feel this way right now, would you come and meet me in this space? Those kinds of prayers to try to center your mind on the Lord and invite Him to come and meet you in a difficult place. The second one, like I said, is to cling to an eternal perspective. That comes from the second half of Psalm 73, 17. He says, I was feeling this way. I had all these doubts and questions until I went to the sanctuary, and then I discerned their end. And he's talking about the wicked, the end of the wicked, how you will punish eventually, you will bring justice eventually, and you will lift up the lowly. And it's this vision of eternity that sustains him in the middle of experiential doubt. And so you'll ask them, maybe, how does this help? But it's pretty straightforward how that helps. And as cheesy as it is, I feel like we feel like it's cheesy to talk about, being sustained through this difficult season because of my hope in heaven. That feels cheesy, I think, to us, but that's literally the only way to make it through experiential doubt in the midst of your Christian faith. Like, you will not survive as a Christian unless you have a strong view and belief and grounding in eternity that can sustain you through the trials and the difficulties of this life. That's the only thing that you can cling to and hope in the midst of a difficult period in your life. And so you have to constantly be reminding yourself of this belief and strengthening it in both seasons of doubt and seasons outside of doubt. So that's kind of wrapping up the full lesson for you guys at the beginning of discussion groups. And then I have just a few questions for you to hit. Again, don't feel like you have to go through all of these. If you need to jump around, if you like question 6 and not question 4, that's totally fine. Question 4 is just a simple, opinionated question. Which of those 4 strategies that we gave? Be honest, check your theology, or have someone else check it for you. Worship and cling to an eternal perspective. Which of those 4 do you feel like is most difficult to do in the midst of having experiential doubt? Which one do you think people struggle with, or would you struggle with, or have you struggled with the most out of those 4? So that's an easy question. No necessarily right or wrong answer there. Number 5 is not as easy of a question, but I think it's a good one to discuss. You will hear people say often, I'm sure almost everyone who's been around church, and even our students, have heard this, that when people are struggling and when they're in a challenging situation, the last thing they need is a theology lesson. And we're going to kind of evaluate that statement. What do we think about that statement in regards to what I'll talk about in the main lesson? That this is kind of how God addresses John the Baptist and Job. Both of them have experiential doubt, and God corrects their theology, both of them. So how do we think about that statement in the midst of kind of what we've just heard? And I'm certainly not saying we should throw that away. I think that's wise counsel in the terms of, like, when someone is in the immediate aftermath of tragedy, it may not be the proper time to, they're not going to hear that very well. They're still trying to process, still trying to digest. But once that period has passed, people need theology. They need truth. And we have to be willing to give that to ourselves and to give that to other people. And sometimes we let this people don't need a theology lesson and suffering spread too far to where we think, like, I can never, they don't need me to say that to them. It's cheesy for me to try to remind them of things that they know, but they're struggling to believe. I think that's wrong. I just think that's a mistake. That is, I have here, that's like us saying the truth will not help people. And we're supposed to be people of truth who serve the God of truth. For us to say that the truth isn't going to help people, and being reminded of the truth and being challenged to believe the truth isn't helpful is just inconsistent with the people that we're supposed to be. The truth is, Asaph talks in Psalm 73 about how he loses his foothold and his faith is almost faltering and stumbling. Truth is the footholds and the finger grip that we have to hang on to in difficult seasons. That's what we rest in, is the truth that may be difficult to believe and may be hard to see, but that's what secures our faith. And so that's what we need. If we don't have it, or if we've forgotten it, or if we're leaving it behind, that's what we need to bring to people oftentimes in the midst of experiential suffering or experiential doubt. Last, number 6, how can we determine when we should deal gently with someone in correcting their theology and when we should give them maybe a sharp rebuke. This comes again from the main lesson. God, again, in both John the Baptist's life and in Job's life, they bring doubts to him, questions to him, and he corrects their thinking and their understanding. Or in John the Baptist's case, Jesus really reminds him of truths that he already knew, but is doubting and almost leaving behind. But he does it in opposite ways. Jesus is very gentle with John the Baptist, and God is sharp, extremely sharp with Job in his correction of his theology. And so, do we have the freedom to do both of those to people? When should we be gentle? When should we be sharp? I've got a couple of thoughts for you there. I think Job's pride is what really gets him this sharp rebuke from the Lord. And oftentimes when our pride is puffed up, we need a pretty stern rebuke in order to just whack that down to the core, even though it's unpleasant. A stern rebuke, reminder, doesn't mean you gotta like stand over them and point at them and yell. It can be when the conversation turns from gentle to being a little more like, hey, you need to hear this right now. So just remind them of that. Stern doesn't mean sharp, doesn't mean I'm screaming at you. We should default to being gentle. That should be our first option. We should be really hesitant. We are not God. Like God gives Job a sharp rebuke because he's all wise and he's all knowing and because he's God and he's able to do that. And so I don't think that means that we never can, but it does mean it's not a 1-for-1 that we should just think we can do that since God did it. And I think lastly, and again, you guys probably have stuff to add to this, as do students, it's helpful for us to know who we're talking to, what their personality is. Can they handle, and do they even more often need a sharp rebuke? I think a lot of the book of Job is about God's knowledge of who Job is and what he can withstand. And so God obviously has a perfect understanding that Job can hear this, is ready to hear this, and this is actually what he needs to hear. We never have that perfect understanding like the Lord does, but we can use wisdom and guidance from the Spirit to help discern that. So those are my ideas, but you guys feel free to add to that. And I will see you guys on Sunday.